if you can have a standard that is going to make food systems more nutritious, then, that is just so exciting. This, relatively short document can have the impact to make 60% of the calories that the world's consumed up to 50% higher in the vitamins that we need the most. I think it's the most exciting thing you could possibly work on.
You are listening to Farm to Fork, a series from The Standard Show, the podcast that brings you the stories behind the standards with Matthew Childs and Cindy Parakill. Today's episode is on food innovation.
Where are we, Cindy Parakill?
Well, Matthew Childs, we are at the To Love Tea and Coffee House in London's Battersea, just down the road from Clapham Junction. And we are waiting for our tea and cake.
We are indeed, and it's a fabulous place, this, isn't it?
Yes.
There must be, 50 different types of black tea on the wall behind the counter over there.
At least.
Now, in terms of cake, after quite a bit of indecision, which I'm prone to here, I went for a slice of Guinness cake to go with my tea. What did you go for in the end?
That sounds delicious. But now, being an Austrian, I do know a thing or two about cakes and pastries. So after close examination of all the options, I went straight for the red velvet. But Matthew, I must say that recently I discovered this new cake. Well, new to me anyway. And that is the Bakewell tart. And I absolutely love it. It's got a nice crust, layers of jam, and I think the perfect amount of flaked almonds on top. Shame that they don't have it here. Do you like it?
Oh, I absolutely adore Bakewell tart. And did you know, Cindy, it's actually named after a place in Derbyshire, after the village of Bakewell, and I used to live near there.
Oh, really? Well, it's absolutely yum.
Well, we are out having tea and cake because, as regular listeners will know, tea and cake has become a big part of the Standard Show's, folklore, I guess, especially about the standards for brewing and tasting of tea. In fact, Cindy, I think those particular standards have probably been mentioned more than any other during the podcast.
Oh, yes. Our listeners probably are experts in this.
Actually, we need to come clean here and fess up, don't we, Cindy?
We do.
That was the genuine sound of a slice of Clapham Battersea cafe culture and the To Love Tea and Coffee House. But we're not actually there. We had planned to be having tea and cake face to face, but unfortunately, reasons mean that it's not been possible. So where are you, Cindy?
At home in West London.
And I'm at home too, but in southeast London. But though we are in two different places today, the plan is that for future episodes of this series, we will indeed be sharing tea and cake at the To Love Tea and Coffee House.
Absolutely. But actually, I do like the sound of that background. So now that we have fessed up, why don't we get producer Tom to bring it back and we can imagine we are there?
Yes, Tom. Can we get a rewind? There we go.
Sweet.
Now, another reason we are having tea and cake, or pretending to now, is because we are celebrating 2 years of the podcast. Woohoo! And recording this almost 2 years to the day, Cindy, that we published the very first episode and started talking about the stories behind the standards.
I know, right? More than 70 episodes, Matthew. Well, happy second birthday to us. Feels like we should be having something a bit stronger than tea, though.
That's true. But the main reason we are going on about tea and cake is because this is the first episode in our series Farm to Fork, the relationship between standards and food.
Now, in this series, our menu of episodes will loosely follow the food cycle of production, packaging, distribution, consumption, and waste management, and feature some of the key standards involved in each of them. We start the series by looking at food innovations, things that may end up transforming what we eat forever.
Playing us in at the top of the episode was the voice of public health nutritionist Jenny Walton from an organisation called Harvest Plus, talking passionately about the standards PAS 233, 234 and 235, which are all about micronutrient-enriched crops. In this episode, we'll hear more from Jenny about these PASs and about those crops, which are being touted as one of the primary solutions to address the problem of what Jenny describes as hidden hunger around the world.
Now, as well as the biofortification of crops, we'll be looking at another high-profile food innovation: It would be fair to say that it is not something that is coming to a supermarket or restaurant anytime soon, but it is something that could dramatically change the way in which we consume protein. And that food innovation is called cultivated meat. Cai Linton from the organization Multus tells us all about it.
After that, we'll hear from a couple of guests about innovations in farming and agri-tech generally. Lynsey Dunbar from the Scottish-based Industrial Biotechnology Innovation Centre tells us about some of the centre's work in using crop and plant-based sources, including sugar beet, to provide sustainable alternatives to fossil fuels.
Yes, and we finish with James Loewenberg de Boer, an academic and standards maker in the field of mobile autonomous crop equipment, or to put it more simply, farm robots. He tells us about the impact they're having on the food system and how they're part of the smart farming revolution.
Now, throughout the series and this episode, we will of course be exploring the role of standards.
Hi, my name is Sara Walton. I'm the lead for the food sector at BSI Knowledge. As I'm sure you can imagine, feeding almost 10 billion people on the planet with a nutritious and sustainable diet would be a mammoth task at the best of times. But this is exactly the task we're going to be facing within the next 25 years. The current pressure on our land, oceans and animals means that finding a sustainable way to feed the world's growing population is going to be one of the most pressing challenges of our time. This means that harnessing technology and exploring alternative and innovative foods will become ever more central to creating more sustainable food production and eating habits. And there are already some incredible changes underway. Selective breeding techniques and propagation methods can help optimize foods by fortifying them with vitamins and minerals. And alternative proteins like microalgae, insects, and lab-grown cultivated meat offer radical alternatives to traditional livestock. But these technologies and alternative food sources really need some conversation happening around them, not only from the agri-foods industry itself and government, regulators, research and academia and other important stakeholders, but also by us, consumers, those who are actually going to be eating these new foods. And this is where the standards come in, and why food is one of BSI's key sectors for standards development. In the agri-food sector, standards help businesses, entrepreneurs and innovators to grow their ideas along with their organisations. And they also help to achieve public policy objectives like supporting the agri-food sector to transition to net zero. Whilst at the same time, standards can help to reassure the public about the food they're eating, and also to know that sustainable action is being taken in order to produce it. This is particularly true for food innovation. Standards provide that clear way for everyone to agree what good looks like.
A reminder that here on The Standards Show, we really welcome your feedback. Please rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts, especially if you listen to us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Find and follow us on Twitter @Standards Show and on Instagram @The Standards Show. And check out the show notes for all of the ways to get in touch. Now, in this episode, it's not cakes where we start, but crops. I had a chat with Jenny Walton, Head of Commercialisation and Scaling at Harvest Plus. Jenny's been working in the field of nutritional content of food for more than 25 years.
Harvest Plus is an organisation that is developing and promoting biofortified food crops that are rich in vitamins and minerals. It's playing a leading role in a global movement to enable and encourage others to scale up biofortification. They anticipate that by 2030, 1 billion people will be benefiting from nutritionally enriched foods.
I spoke to Jenny about this term, biofortification, and the 3 PASs being developed in this area. Usually sponsored by industry, government, trade associations or professional bodies, a publicly available specification or PAS is a fast-track standard. They're a powerful way to establish the integrity of an innovation. But I started by asking Jenny to tell me more about the work of Harvest Plus.
So Harvest Plus has a really amazing role in a problem that's affecting the world. And what most people don't realize is that a quarter of the population are suffering from malnutrition or hidden hunger, which is micronutrient deficiency. And what the idea was nearly 20 years ago is that given that the majority of the world's calories come from 8 basic staple foods, so the wheat, the rice, the maize, and the beans, that if everybody's eating those foods, if we just made those foods much more healthier and they contained higher amounts of micronutrients, then we could go a long way to eradicating hidden hunger in the population. So we coined the phrase biofortification, which is about how to make those plants do the work themselves and naturally fortify themselves with nutrients, so that when everybody in the population consumes their usual diet, they're getting a much higher amount of vitamins A, zinc, and iron in the foods that they eat on a regular basis.
And Jenny, what about your role for Harvest Plus? What do you do?
So I'm a nutritionist by background and a public health nutritionist, and I've always worked in the food industry. So I've worked in big global food businesses and retailers and manufacturers. And my role has always been about how you take the benefits of food and nutrition to consumers and promote foods on the benefits of those properties. So whether it's pointing out the benefits of breakfast cereals or pre or probiotics, it's how nutritionists translate that technical information to consumers. So my role at Harvest Plus is around taking the benefits of the nutrient-enriched crops, of the biofortified crops, and how we promote them to businesses who will use them, and importantly to consumers who will eat them.
Now, you mentioned this term biofortification. I'm interested in this. So is it the same, as crop enrichment? What are we talking about here? Are those terms interchangeable?
Yes, so biofortification is more the process. So at Harvest Plus, in Harvest Plus terms, biofortification is the process of using conventional plant breeding, so the kind of stuff that Mendel did hundreds of years ago, so just cross-breeding plants to get the best traits from them, or in some cases agronomic fortification, so that's using fertilizers while plants are growing to actually end up with a crop that's much higher in micronutrient content. So biofortification is the process, and then you end up with nutrient-enriched crops or nutrient-enriched crops.
So this sort of term then, biofortification, how long has that been with us?
So the actual term biofortification came about with the Harvest Plus project, but the notion of improving a plant's nutritional properties has been around for hundreds of years. So wanting to get the best out of agriculture and breeding crops and foods that actually contain more nutrition is centuries old. But it came to be an actual term to combat international micronutrient malnutrition around 20 years ago, where it was realized that you could actually use this very sort of almost basic technology really to improve the diets of everybody. So to be used as like a public health intervention, biofortification has only been around for around 20 years.
What was the objective behind the original research programme pioneered by Harvest Plus?
The original objective of Harvest Plus was to reach the world's most vulnerable consumers, so farming families, very low-income farming families who rely on the food that they've grown at home, and they don't have access to markets and supermarkets. They grow the food at home and sell surplus off to market. So those groups of people are really hard to reach because they're not buying food and you can't get to them with supplements. So the intention was to offer those farming families much more nutrient-enriched versions of the crops and the foods that they were growing at home. So if they were a maize farmer and they were growing maize, then we would take the biofortified vitamin A maize version to them, so they would grow healthier crops at home. And that's what we started out doing over 20 years ago with the aim to reach the most vulnerable and hard to reach communities. And since then, we've grown to bigger farmers and rural and urban populations, and now how the benefits of nutrient-enriched crops have opportunities for everybody in the food system.
I mean, you mentioned there's some of the benefits, and I wonder, sustainability and the UN Sustainability Development Goals are very important here. And just wonder, how can this sort of farming and sort of biofortification of crops, how can they help contribute to sustainability over the long term?
When talking about the actual SDGs, biofortification and nutrient-enriched crops fits directly into number 2, which is zero hunger, and number 3, which is good health and well-being, but also indirectly impacts the rest of the SDGs, and particularly number 13 on climate action. So as the world's temperature is getting warmer, it means that the growing cycle of crops is getting shorter, which I think is a good thing. So it takes less time for crops to grow. But if they have less time to grow, they have less time to assimilate the micronutrients in the finished grain. So biofortification goes a long way to actually counteract that issue of climate change. And also the varieties that are developed through the CGIAR program and the expert breeders in the CG, we also take into consideration aspects such as drought tolerance, pest resistance. So everything that's developed has to be climate smart and competitive with the other seed products that are on the market.
So I can see here how there is, obviously this is a food innovation in a sense, well, in reality, and you're making changes here. But often with innovations or changes in technology or the way technology is applied, there can be some sort of unintended consequences from making those changes. So I wonder with here, are there any interesting or unintended consequences from implementing enrichment programs, maybe in different areas or with different crops maybe?
Yeah, absolutely. And what the sort of founders of the Harvest Plus program didn't realize was how biofortification and nutrient-enriched crops is in a area of massive growth in the food industry. So consumers want foods that are naturally nutritious. They want foods that don't have a complicated label, so they don't want added ingredients. The whole rise of plant-based foods that are high in nutrients as their meat alternatives, ethical purchasing, and buying products that actually does something good for the world is in massive growth, and it's getting bigger. The sort of impact of COVID on there has really changed consumers' behaviour. Not to mention the interest in the vitamins A, zinc and iron, as they have a huge role in immunity and protecting yourself against viruses. So given that that's a huge trend, and it's going to really help the actual demand for nutrient-enriched crops and demand for biofortification and demand for the work of the Harvest Plus program, because it has a huge commercial benefit. So we're able to have developed something that we thought was going to be, government funded, and something that was going to require sort of sponsorship that we'd take to the world's most vulnerable people. But really, everybody needs this technology, and food businesses can actually start and grow because of this innovation.
So Jenny, tell me about your standards journey. How and when did it start for you, and where are you now?
Standards have been part of my career, and having worked in the food industry, there's a standard for everything. So whether it's in food safety, or whether it's for food product labeling, or whether it's advertising and making nutrition and health claims. So I always knew that standards were absolutely critical when it comes to commercializing food. But when it started working on biofortification, we realized it was really difficult to differentiate the nutrient-enriched grains from the grains that people were consuming already. And this difficulty in distinguishing nutrient-enriched crops from the standard was throughout the value chain. So whether you're buying seeds, you're buying grains, or buying foods, it was really difficult for the buyer to actually decide if they were buying the right product. And we went through the entire value chain in all the countries that we operate in and found that the most critical gap in standards was at grain level. And if you were a trader, so if you're a farmer trying to sell your biofortified, nutrient-enriched grains, or you were a food business looking to buy them, there was nothing there to say, I need to buy it according to this standard, or I need it to this level. So we looked for all different solutions. We talked to governments about making legislation. We talked to codex. We looked at the sort of length and breadth that we operate in different markets, and if we could have a standard at each country level for each crop. And we netted at the PAS process as being the best for us because we could develop an international standard, so a stake in the ground for nutrient-enriched crops that could be used in every single country. And we decided to do it on a nutrient basis so that we cover all of the crops that we deal with by nutrient. So we started with the PAS for zinc because the zinc crops were actually reaching the most consumers. So we wanted to do a PAS that was had the most benefit to the most people quickly as possible. And then we moved on to the iron crops. And now finally we're doing the vitamin A crops, so the PAS 235 for vitamin A crops.
Clarifications corner here. PAS 233 specifies the requirements for zinc-enriched wheat, maize and rice grain intended as food for human consumption. PAS 234 specifies the requirements for iron-enriched bean and pearl millet intended as food for human consumption. And PAS 235, well, that specifies requirements for pro-vitamin A enriched maize grain, cassava root and sweet potato root intended, you guessed it, as food for human consumption. And what impact are you hoping these international standards will have for those growing and supplying enriched crops?
So for growers to have a product that conforms to a standard is really important. So they're able to talk with confidence and say, I have grown this grain that conforms to PAS 233. And that instantly shows value to traders to say that it's been grown to a specific condition or level or authority has said that this is the right product. So it instantly gives growers a benefit over the standard grains because the value is there and that you can advertise that value more freely to traders. And then from the other aspect, from the demand aspect, if you're a trader and you ask for a grain that conforms to this PAS, it makes it much easier for the grower to know what to grow. So it has instant benefits for growers who are able to advertise their products and traders who are able to demand something very specific that helps the farmer know what to grow.
So in terms of the impact there on the sort of the growers and also the buyers, but is there what sort of longer term impact do you hope to see on the entire food chain?
It's going to take some time to set in, so we're not expecting results overnight. But although we are seeing people demanding and trading using the PAS already. But the idea is that now that we have bridged this gap in grain trade and we have an authority standard on the subject, that it will make traceability much easier so that we now have end-to-end standards in place for nutrient-enriched grains, that we can now do end-to-end traceability to ensure that the seeds produce a food and the nutrient enrichment is then present in the processed foods where the consumers are buying it in markets, and not just in the developing countries or the emerging markets, but in countries like the UK or the US where consumers are building that demand and making the technology more mainstream. So it will impact the wider global food system as well as local smallholder food production.
You mentioned earlier, Jenny, the sort of recognition that throughout your career, standards has been part of your professional life. I just wonder that now being involved in the development of one, what's the experience been like?
It's funny, really. When I was much younger, I used to find like standards and regulations really boring, and you'd go along to like a meeting and people start talking about standards and regulations, and that my younger self would be sort of, oh, don't understand it, and do we really have to? And it's a lot of text, and what does it really mean? But the more mature side of me now sees how impactful standards are, and in food systems in particularly, but if you can have a standard that is going to make food systems more nutritious, then that is just so exciting. This relatively short document can have the impact to make 60% of the calories that the world's consumed up to 50% higher in the vitamins that we need the most. I think it's the most exciting thing you could possibly work on.
So I'll give you a chance here to talk to young Jenny or young Jennies, people similar to you, maybe at the start of their professional career. What would you say to your younger self about standards?
I think if you realise the practicalities of them and how it actually impacts in real life situations, then you realise why they are interesting and why they are important. That standards are not just words on a page; they have an impact. They have an impact on the way people do their jobs. They have an impact on the way people do business. They have a huge commercial impact. That if buyers and traders, it won't happen if the standards aren't followed. So really understanding the impact of standards and the practicalities and how it impacts real life makes it a lot easier to absorb and sort of understand how it works.
I just wonder if you were looking forward in sort of 2 or 3 years' time, what impact do you hope those standards to really have had?
We hope that anybody who wants nutrient-rich crops in their supply chains will specifically mention the PAS when they're demanding the commodity or selling their commodity. And that's not just in commercial food production, so whether the big brands making food, but also in procurement for institutional settings. So whether it's the World Food Programme procuring grains for emergency response, or whether it's schools, hospitals, or prisons buying foods, that they demand grain that conforms to those specific PAS numbers.
Matthew, it was really interesting what Jenny was saying there about what might be seen as quite minor interventions in the food itself, but those interventions have the potential to have a huge impact on addressing that hidden hunger in the world. Now, details of those 3 PASs, 233, 234, and 235 that Jenny has been involved with can be found in the show notes.
We move now from cereals to meat, or rather, cultivated meat. We'll hear my conversation with Cai Linton, a bioengineer and founder and CEO of an organisation called Multus. They're developing the key ingredient in this technology, what's called the growth media, with the aim of making cultivated meat affordable and profitable. I spoke to him about the history of the technology, the potential health benefits of cultivated meat, and some of the ethical issues too, and naturally, about the role of standards. But I started by asking him what is meant by this term, cultivated meat.
Cultivated meat is really a new industry, a new way of producing the same meat we know and love today, just without using animals as a factory, as a production vehicle. And so these companies now, there are about 85 across the world, maybe more. There seems to be more every month. But these companies are taking a very small sample of cells from an animal and then putting them in kind of in an environment to grow outside the animal. So you can imagine, like we brew beer, these companies are growing meat cells and meat tissues, muscle and fat and connective tissue without using animals, but using these large kind of industrial metal tanks. And this is a much more efficient process than it is to use animals. You can make production runs in 40 days instead of 4 years. And really, the benefits across land and energy and water and antibiotics are they're massive. But one of the major things holding back this whole industry is the cost of feeding those cells with the right kinds of nutrients. And so this is really where we come in. We design and select new kinds of nutrients that are affordable and scalable for the food industry. And also we have a process to figure out how to combine them in the right way to actually grow a chicken cell or a pig cell or a cow cell.
Can you give us a brief history about this particular food innovation? How and when did it start?
Yeah, so really the kind of, in terms of the history of cultivated meat, back in 2013, 2014, it was a group from the Netherlands, Professor Mark Post, that introduced cultivated meat, at least to the world, in a major way. So he, with his kind of university, grew the first cultivated meat hamburger. He introduced it in London, and it cost about $300,000 to make just that one single burger. So crazy price point, but a demonstration nonetheless that this could really be a viable solution in the future. And then ever since then, kind of the first major companies were set up in 2015 and 2016. And since then, there's been growth every single year, with companies like us focusing on specific enabling technologies, others that are looking more at the kind of branding and product side. And so it's a really rich ecosystem now, from kind of foundational research in academia right through to large corporations that are pivoting and acquiring companies in this space as well.
And where is the sort of technology and the industry right now?
So the leading edge of this industry today is really at the pilot scale. So there's actually only one company in the world that has a product that they're selling on the market. It's a company called Eat Just over in Singapore. But there are many more companies that are producing still relatively small quantities of cultivated meat, but going through that regulatory process. And really, we expect in the next kind of 3 to 4 years that there'll be maybe 10 or more companies that have products on the market, initially at restaurant scale, but over this next decade, really scaling their production and bringing their products to supermarket levels.
And are there any particular risks associated with this food innovation?
Not particularly. I mean, so there's we're working with new biotechnologies. Part of the way that this whole industry is going about its process to minimize risk is to be very transparent, is to hold the highest production standards and safety standards possible. And you're really, growing real cells. So actually, you can create a much cleaner product, one that doesn't have antibiotics inside, doesn't have microplastics or heavy metals like you might find in fish. And so there's an opportunity here to truly create the same or even better meat products than we have today, but in a much more affordable, much more sustainable way than industrial farming.
I want to come back and ask you about standards. Now, you mentioned there about how the cultivated meat is grown and the sort of the health issues. I mean, are there additional health benefits here for this particular type of meat?
Absolutely. So there's an opportunity to create a healthy cultivated meat burger, if you like, because there's this ability to really customize what goes into that final product. You can decide the ratio of muscle and fat tissues. You can decide where those fat tissues come from in the first place. You might want to combine healthy salmon fats with a lean chicken muscle, and that's totally possible now with cultivated meat. You can also then supplement these products with additional vitamins if you want as well, to make a super healthy cultivated meat product that is designed to be very nutritious.
Now, we've seen some obviously huge changes over the last 20, 30 years or so in terms of people becoming vegetarians and a growth in veganism as well. So I just wonder, are there any ethical issues here for this particular type of food?
I would say there aren't really major ethical issues with this food at all. It's a new kind of food that we're bringing to market, but really it's taking cells in a very standard way. Taking cell biopsies from animals is very routine today in the livestock industry, and then it's growing those cells with ingredients and nutrients that are designed and suitable for food production. And there's safety standards and certification and regulation at every step of the way. Of course, as you mentioned, there's more and more vegans and vegetarians, particularly in the UK and Western countries. But actually, the trend is towards more and more meat consumption. As large countries have a growing middle class and growing demand and consumption of meat products, they don't want to be told, suddenly we're forcing the world not to eat meat. And generally, people, when they think about meat, taste and cost are number one, and then maybe health and sustainability are much lower down on that list. So it's about creating options, creating sustainable options, so people can be vegan and vegetarian if they want to. People can have access to good quality, tasty, affordable, sustainable, cultivated meat if they want to. And maybe there's still an option also for the conventional livestock reared meat too on the market. So I don't think it's a matter of one or the other. It's a matter of creating sustainable abundance in meat.
Now, in terms of obviously any innovation, is all about sort of market disruption. And I just wonder, you've mentioned there about sort of traditional meat. I mean, what are the implications here for the traditional meat industry of this new innovation?
So, of course, we're creating a competing product in many ways, but that doesn't mean that the farming industry necessarily loses out. We're creating opportunities and solutions that incorporate the farming industry. We're actually part of a project now funded by the UK government to look at how we can build solutions that farmers can work with today, or maybe adapt and evolve their practices to support these kind of new alternative proteins into the future. And farmers have a large part to play in many areas of the supply chain. So the first, relating to growth media, really what we're working on, they can be growing crops that create the micronutrients required to grow different cells, much like they do for the livestock industry, but those crops and nutrients will go much further because they're being used in a more efficient way. There are also companies that are working with farmers to rear certain species of animals and cows and pigs, and use them as sources of cells intermittently. So those animals can live a healthy, happy life, and then every so often a very small amount of cells are taken to then take and grow the next batch of cultivated meat. So there's a way of living in harmony with cultivated meat and the farming industry. There's also groups, particularly in the Netherlands, and funding actually very recently in the Netherlands to look at how farmers could even have their own local production of cultivated meat. And we then move to a model similar to what we have today, where there are farmers producing the meat locally and for the local kind of area, and then that value chain continues, and somebody takes that mass of meat and processes it into your different burgers and sausages, etc., and then somebody takes it to retail and puts it in front of customers. So there are definitely ways that farmers can be involved, and really we're also creating more jobs within cultivated meat, so expanding the ability for people to work in food and to be close to how their food is produced.
So standards then, what's the role for standards in this particular form of food innovation?
Standards have a major role in cultivated meat and alternative proteins more generally. Obviously, there are those relating to safety and production processes. So food safe production processes, ISOs 9001 and 22000 are pretty common in the food industry already. We can really model our production sites according to those standards. But then also when considering specific safety tests that you might want to conduct, looking at the profile of the end product, whether it's impurities or nutritional profiles, there are standards involved there as well. And then talking about innovation, creating standards or frameworks that people can innovate within can actually help this industry be more compatible with each other. There are lots of companies now almost reinventing the wheel, as it were, by working on similar technologies and challenges, but an element of standardization can actually help these companies create solutions that work together and accelerate the industry forward. So we're in discussion with BSI. We're bringing together different stakeholders across the cultivated meat industry, companies, governments, consumers, other stakeholders, standards organizations, to think about how can we create working groups around new standards and put together opinion pieces and work towards creating new standards that the industry can work with. We're also involved with the Alternative Protein Association. So this is a UK association that's really working with stakeholders and the UK government to create a better system for supporting funding, regulatory processes and talent creation within the UK to support the next generation of alternative proteins in the UK.
You mentioned earlier, Cai, about sort of safety issues. I just wonder, from you are a manufacturer working in this innovative space. From your perspective, what's the importance, in terms of the relationship between standards and regulation? How do you view that from a manufacturer's perspective?
Standards and regulation are very closely linked. So when we're thinking about manufacturing, there are two sides to this. So there's the manufacturing process itself, and there are oftentimes many standards involved with having safe food manufacturing processes and reporting lines and standard operating procedures that we can comply with and be certified for our production processes. And then there's the regulation safety element to the ingredients and inputs themselves, and this is often where kind of regulation comes in. So there might be a specific ingredient that we have approved by the Food Safety Authority to be consumed by humans, and then so if we can use that safe ingredient that's approved by the regulatory bodies in a production process that's approved by the standard organizations, then we can create products that we can then market and produce at scale in a safe way for people, for the end consumers.
Food for thought.
Proteins are the building blocks of our bodies, necessary for both growth and maintenance. And meat is one of the primary sources of those proteins. But our eating habits are changing. Meat consumption in the UK, for example, has fallen by 17% in the past decade. As an alternative, broccoli is relatively high in protein, making up 29% of its dry weight. In fact, it contains more protein per calorie than steak. But don't get too excited. Because of its high water content, 100 grams of broccoli only provides 3 grams of protein. So you'd need to eat a lot more broccoli to get the same number of calories than you do from the meat. Cindy, I was particularly interested in there and what Cai said about some of the potential benefits of cultivated meat as a source of protein in terms of efficiencies. Now, you're an economist. He talked about producing the same amount of food in 4 months as it might take in 4 years with traditional livestock methods.
Yes, that's true. But I suppose, as he says, we are some way off yet this being a normal, or me buying it in a supermarket or eating it in a restaurant. But I suppose if it does take off, this will change the meat industry dramatically. And it'll be interesting to observe the standards development process for it too. There's also a strong element of science fiction about it, isn't there?
That's it. That's what I felt too. I mean, it feels incredibly futuristic. But I also wonder, what do you think about the end product? Can you see yourself eating a laboratory-grown meat burger?
Well, I guess so. I mean, I don't think I have any ethical objections. It'll be certainly interesting to do a taste test.
It will indeed. Now, actually listening to Cai describing how the cells will be safely taken from animals, it reminded me of something I read in a Diary of the Wimpy Kid series of children's books. Do you know these?
No, I don't.
Now, this is an incredibly successful book series about a boy called Greg Heffley, about his life and his family and the scrapes he gets into. Now, he has a couple of brothers, a younger one called Manny, who gets away with everything, and an older one called Roderick, who's a bit daft. Now, in one of the books called The Long Haul, the family go on a road trip. And on that trip, they stop off at a country fair, and Manny ends up winning a pig in a guess the weight competition. Now, of course, the family think there's no way they can keep the pig. But Roderick says at one point they need to keep the pig so they can have bacon every day. Now, obviously, that was daft because you'd have to kill the pig. But listening to Cai, by taking those cells in a safe way and then growing the meat in a lab, then I suppose this could really happen.
Now, while you muse on that, Matthew, we need to take a look at some innovations in farming and agri-tech in general. We're going to hear from Lynsey Dunbar from the Industrial Biotechnology Innovation Centre. Launched in 2014 with public funding from the Scottish Government, the Centre is a network and support organisation that connects industry, academia, and government to bring biotechnology processes and products to market. With labs at Strathclyde and Heriot-Watt universities, it has a membership of 140 organisations across Scotland, the UK, and Europe. Biotechnology uses plant-based and waste resources to produce or process materials, chemicals, and energy, offering, for example, sustainable alternatives to fossil fuels, important for helping to reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
I'm back from our musings now, Cindy. I started by asking Lynsey about agriculture's own contributions to those emissions.
It's one sector that's quite a significant contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. And the IPCC's special report on climate change and land estimates that agriculture is directly responsible for about 8.5% of all greenhouse gases and a further 14.5% coming from land use. And that's on a global scale. And from a UK perspective, agriculture is directly responsible for around 10% of greenhouse gas produced in the UK. So I think it will become increasingly important to find solutions to decarbonise agriculture and achieve net zero ambitions. And we've got quite a lot of companies in our network that are working on novel solutions in this space already. So a few examples are, we've got vertical farming is one solution that's being explored, and they're looking at growing certain crops, and it's a really interesting solution using vertical farming for urban areas where they have quite limited land use availability. And other companies as well, they're exploring the development of feed for livestock, which can help reduce the amount of methane they produce. Cows can be a bit gassy. So when, for example, looking at seaweed-derived feeds, and they can help reduce the methane produced by cattle as well. And then there are companies that are moving away from traditional agriculture to develop novel ways to manufacture foods. So, for example, they could be taking something that's considered a byproduct or a waste. So, say, whiskey co-products is one example, to make an alternative protein with that. So, making something that's quite similar to corn. So, one really good example of a project that we're working on in the agri-tech space is sugar beet. So Scotland is currently exploring the possibility of reintroducing sugar beet as a rotational crop to be utilised as a source of biofuel or as a feedstock for sustainable manufacturing. And the rationale behind this is Grangemouth, which is Scotland's main chemical manufacturing site, is being targeted as a main source of emissions, as it's responsible for about 10% of Scotland's CO2 emissions per annum. So the introduction of sugar beet as a feedstock in Scotland would create a brand new supply chain, and it could also future-proof manufacturing at Grangemouth by offering an alternative to fossil fuels for some processes, and also ensuring the fossil fuels that we do have that are finite can last longer to use in other processes as well. And it could be the foundation of a carbon-negative bio-based chemicals industry in Scotland. And it's very much envisioned, we see this as a two-stage process. So in the first stage, it will focus on reshoring Scotland's ethanol supply chain. So currently, bioethanol is imported from Europe for blending into petrol in Scotland. And last September, the government mandated E10 in petrol, which means that 10% of bioethanol must be blended into petrol. Previously, it was only 5%, so this effectively doubled the UK demand for bioethanol overnight. So the UK produces approximately 900 million litres, and now the E10 has been introduced, the need is around about 1.7 billion litres. So that leaves a shortfall of around 800 million litres. At the moment, we have 3 bioethanol facilities in the UK. We've got Vivergo and Ensis, which are both wheat-based, and then British Sugar also has a smaller sugar beet-based bioethanol facility as well. And then in next stage, in stage 2, we very much see when electric vehicles are becoming more prominent, that there will already be an established supply chain in place. So this could be converted to manufacture more bio-based chemicals. and offer a nice homogeneous feedstock for manufacturing instead of relying on fossil fuels. Of course, there are alternative bioresources already available, primarily through wastes, and it was identified by Zero Waste Scotland that there's 27 million tonnes of biomass that's available in Scotland, but it's spread across the country, and it'd be quite difficult to establish any manufacturing at scale that's reliant on waste generated from other industries. So that's, again, another reason why we're quite interested in looking at sugar beet. And to date, Scottish Enterprise, they've commissioned an initial study into the viability of sugar beet in Scotland, which was undertaken by the NNFCC, who are bio-based consultants based in York, and it showed quite initial promising results. So after that, they decided to do some follow-on work on sugar beet, and some growth trials were undertaken at the James Hutton Institute, along with 4 different farm sites as well for growth trials, and they're all based in the east coast of Scotland. And the reason for that is it's the only region in Scotland that's capable of growing sugar beet due to its climate and also the availability of arable land. I think it's going to become increasingly important as we move towards the net zero target set by the government. So in Scotland, that net zero target is by 2045, and then in the UK, it's 2050. So I think that policymakers and companies alike are going to be looking for more solutions where they can reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, and they can green their manufacturing processes. And I think as well, post-pandemic, there's also an interest in how we can reshore some of our supply chains and also create more local supply chains, so we're not relying on getting our feedstocks from a global supplier, because that has been a challenge a lot of companies have faced during the pandemic.
Food for thought.
Lynsey mentioned vertical farming. Now, this is the practice of growing crops in vertically stacked layers. It often incorporates soilless farming techniques such as hydroponics, aquaponics, and aeroponics. Lettuce, rocket, and other salad types are some of the most common crops grown in vertical farms. The world's largest vertical farm, with nearly 14,000 square metres of growing space, the equivalent of 96 tennis courts stacked on top of each other, is set to open in the UK later this year.
It was really fascinating to hear from Lynsey about what could become a brand new industry in Scotland around growing sugar beet to produce greener fuels. I think that's really a good example of public-private academic partnership around innovation.
That's right. Now, sticking with farming, we thought we should have a look at some of the technology being used in farming itself. I spoke to James Loewenberg de Boer, Professor in Agri-Tech Applied Economics at Harper Adams University, and also a standards maker in the area of agricultural machinery and technology. I talked to him about the impact this technology has had on the food system, and also what is meant by this term smart farming. But I started by asking him about Harper Adams. I put it to him that this is a UK university that many people may not be that familiar with.
I like to say that Harper Adams is a relatively small university, but a big agricultural university. So I worked for many years at a couple of large agricultural universities in the United States, and Harper has as many students as many of those very, very large agricultural universities. But Harper is different in the sense that it's all related to agriculture, broadly speaking. That agriculture includes logistics of the food system. It includes off-road non-farm vehicles as well as farm machinery. So it's a very broad interpretation of what agriculture is, but all related to agriculture.
Now, James, you're a professor in Agri-Tech Applied Economics at Harper. Can you tell us about your research interests?
Yeah, so my career has been focused on the economics of agricultural technology. So I help identify what problems farmers have that could be potentially resolved by technology. I work with engineers and soil scientists and other scientists to develop the technology in a cost-effective way. I work with entrepreneurs to help them commercialize that technology and put it into a marketing and supply system that works for the agricultural industry. And then I spend a lot of time measuring how much of that technology that's marketed and commercialized is actually used, because that's the best measure of whether or not farmers and agribusinesses find it useful, if they buy that technology, invest in it, and use it.
Now, I want to come back to the issue of agricultural technology, but before we get there, now you have become a standards maker. Now, here on the podcast, we love our standards journeys of our guests. So how and when did your standards journey start, and where are you now?
So I'm part of a committee that is developing UK standards for mobile autonomous crop equipment. And the way that I became involved was that I'm the economist for Hands Free Farm, which is a Harper Adams effort to do research and to demonstrate that autonomous farm equipment is both technically feasible and economically viable. In some meetings with stakeholders, so with farmers, with entrepreneurs, with insurance companies, it became clear that the UK needed some kind of standards to help people understand how to use that technology. So there are a number of ISO and other standards that guide the engineering of the technology. But in terms of actually using it, that is a much more open field. And there are some standards in Australia, but of course, the context of rural Australia is very different from the quite densely populated countryside in the UK. And so, through those stakeholders, I got into contact with the British Standards Institute and became involved with this group developing the standards for the UK.
And in terms of agricultural technology broadly then, what impact does that have on the food system?
Agricultural technology, in short, is what provides us with food security, that it helps us grow more, better quality food on less land with less labor, and if correctly used, with less of a pressure on the environment. And I have quite a number of examples throughout my career of where technology has helped. But just one example: before I came to Harper, I worked with the Gates Foundation on introducing grain storage technology in Africa. And in the Republic of Niger, the production of cowpeas, which is a high protein, very nutritious food, increased by a factor of 10 after we resolved the storage problem for farmers and merchants. So technology can have a real impact on food security.
And in terms of sort of the latest developments then, thinking maybe about sort of mobile farm machinery or crop robots, if that's a term that we use, are they the future of farming?
All over the world, farmers are struggling to find workers, and that motivates a lot of work on autonomous crop machines. Robots are what they're commonly called in the media, mostly among those people who work on them. They tend more often to be called autonomous crop machines. But those that struggle to find labor appears in all kinds of countries of all income levels. And it's exacerbated because some of the technologies that we've used to reduce labor, say, for instance, like herbicide, are either declining in effectiveness because of weed resistance, or those chemicals are now not being certified because of environmental issues. And so the move is toward autonomous equipment, and we can see this now starting to appear in commercial agricultural machinery. So all of the major farm equipment manufacturers have autonomous machine development programs. A few of those companies have announced that they're actually selling those products. We know of over 40 startup companies around the world that are developing and starting to market crop robots or autonomous machines, mostly smaller ones than the major farm equipment companies are working on. And we know of at least 6 companies worldwide that are selling retrofit kits that will allow someone to convert conventional farm equipment, tractors or self-propelled equipment, into autonomous use. So yes, it is the future, and it will have at least as much impact on the way agriculture is done and how it's structured as motorized mechanization did in the early 20th century.
And is there a particular sort of country here or group of countries that's leading the field in the use of this technology?
As always, this is not concentrated in just one country, but you find certain areas of expertise. So in terms of specialized weeding robots, a lot of the work is happening in various EU countries, in Denmark, in Switzerland, in Germany. And in part, that is because farmers there are really struggling with weed control because of very strict regimes in terms of managing pesticides. Larger farm equipment, autonomous farm equipment, a lot of it seems to be developed in North America, and that makes sense. It's a place of big farms with big fields, and so it's there. UK has really taken a lead in practical applications of autonomous equipment in areas with small, irregularly shaped fields, which characterizes much of British agriculture. And Hands-Free Farm at Harper has been part of that movement, but there's a number of startup companies that are really focusing on the potential of that market.
Now, people may have heard this term smart farming. Can you tell us what that is, and also the work that ISO is doing to develop this area?
So smart farming has many definitions, but they all seem to center on using information technology to make agriculture better. So make it more profitable, make it less risky, reduce the environmental load from agriculture. And ISO is now looking at what kind of standards beyond what they already have are needed to help facilitate the growth of this kind of technology. And so one of the examples, and I happen to be on the ISO Strategic Advisory Group for Smart Farming, and one of the issues that has come up is what kind of information in what format and what media should be provided to non-farmers in rural areas. So if you're somebody who goes out walking their dog in the countryside, what do you want to know about robotic crop equipment that's working in the field through which you walk? And in Britain, unlike Australia or most of North America, farm fields often have public walkways, pathways through them. And so there is this potential interaction, and it's important that we have some standards there, because if farm equipment, autonomous farm equipment, is exported throughout the world, then it should be done in a standardized way so that it can be generally useful, not just useful in one specific place. So I became involved because I was already involved in the autonomous crop machine code of practice here in the UK, and so I was asked to represent the UK on this committee. In particular, I have been involved in the subgroup for the social aspects of these standards, and part of the mandate of ISO in this particular effort is to further the achievement of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And so that means having standards that apply not just in industrialized developed countries, but also in less developed countries to help. This is another revolution in agriculture that's coming that's going to have massive effects. Those effects could be quite positive in terms of reducing environmental loading from agriculture, in terms of making small and medium-sized farms more technically efficient, in terms of producing higher quality food with less fewer pesticides and so on and so forth. So they should be aware of that. And what we hope is that there's an understanding of that, or willingness to consider that when it comes to autonomous equipment working in fields and so on.
Well, Cindy, we have gone from nutritionally enriched crops to cultivated meat to growing crops for more sustainable fuels to robots on farms.
Yes, we have. And we should say our thanks to Jenny Walton, Cai Linton, Lynsey Dunbar and James Loewenberg de Boer, and also to Sara Walton of BSI for taking part in this episode and giving us so much content to chew on. And for more information on food innovation and those PAZs, check out the links in the show notes.
And we finish with James there on farming, Cindy, because it links nicely to some of the things we are going to cover in the next episode.
Yes, because part of that involves us being down on the farm.
It does. It includes the wearing of wellies and the meeting of cows. Or as we like to think of it, it's where the Standard Show meets BBC Radio 4's Farming Today.
You have been listening to Farm to Fork, a series from The Standard Show. Subscribe to us now, wherever you get your podcasts.
You just heard a Stripped Media production.